History rarely hands us certainties. It deals in traces, probabilities, and the careful weighing of sources. When we ask whether Jesus of Nazareth was a historical person, we are not debating theology, but evidence. What kinds of records survive, what they say, how they fit together, and how likely it is that they point to an actual man who lived in first-century Judea. Whatever one believes, the impact of the movement associated with him, Christianity, on law, ethics, art, education, social welfare, and politics is so vast that understanding its beginnings matters for everyone. Cathedrals and hospitals, universities and charitable networks, masterpieces of painting and music, the rhythms of calendars and holidays, and centuries of moral debate all bear the imprint, for good and for ill, of Christian ideas taking root in different societies. So this is a look at documented history, not devotion, a clear, critical pass through the evidence that historians have and what it allows us to say. Direct physical evidence for specific individuals in antiquity is far rarer than most people expect, even for elites. Much of what we know about famous names comes down to a few inscriptions, a handful of coins, or one or two carved stones. Consider Pontius Pilate, the Roman prefect who appears in multiple literary sources. Archaeologically, he is concretely attested by the so-called Pilate stone, one inscription, and a small set of coins minted during his tenure. That is how archaeology works across the ancient world. Time crushes most records, and even famous careers can shrink to a shard of limestone and a few letters of a name. If that is true for governors and high priests, it is even more true for ordinary people. Jesus, according to the earliest stories, was a Jewish teacher of humble means, moving around villages and towns in a small Roman province. He commissioned no monuments, established no dynasty, and left no palace or archive. Given those circumstances, the expectation that a definitive Jesus object would survive all the way to today is unrealistic. What we do occasionally find are pieces that brush the edges of his circle. One of the most discussed examples surfaced publicly in 2002, a typical first-century Jewish ossuary bearing an Aramaic inscription that reads, "James, son of Joseph, brother of Jesus." Ossuaries were common in Judea at the time, stone boxes used in secondary burials after the flesh had decomposed, storing the bones of the deceased. This ossuary is dated to the 1st century, which matches the era in question. The fact that the inscription connects 3 names, James, Joseph, and Jesus, sparked immediate interest. Some suggested that these could be the bones of James the Just, a figure who appears in Christian sources as the brother of Jesus and son of Joseph. The allure is obvious. If genuine and correctly identified, it would represent a tangible, physical thread tied to the family of Jesus. But specialists are divided, and it is important to be precise about why. First, James, Jacob, Joseph, Yosef, and Jesus, Yeshua, were among the most common names in Judea at the time. On statistical grounds alone, the combination does not prove that the inscription refers to those specific individuals. The authenticity of the inscription itself has been questioned. Some scholars and investigators have argued that part or all of the text could have been added later, while others have defended its integrity by basing their arguments on patina and tool mark analysis. The object remains from the 1st century, but whether the full inscription is original and whether it truly names the James, Joseph, and Jesus of Christian tradition are matters still debated. For someone like Jesus, a common, poor man from a provincial backwater, it would be surprising, not expected, if a direct personal object had survived. If the ground is stingy with artifacts, ancient literature is more generous, though not always simple. References from writers who were not Christians are particularly valuable because they had no stake in promoting Christian beliefs. Even hostile voices can serve as evidence that a person was known and discussed. One such witness is the Roman senator and jurist Gaius Plinius Caecilius Secundus, Pliny the Younger. Early in the 2nd century, as a provincial governor, Pliny exchanged letters with Emperor Trajan asking how to handle the growing numbers of Christians in his jurisdiction. Should he punish them, offer them a path back to the Roman cults? ignore them if they were peaceful. In describing their practices, he notes that the Christians sang hymns to Christ almost as a god. That phrase, almost as a god, matters because it hints at a moment in which veneration of Jesus had not yet been systematized into formal doctrine everywhere. Pliny is not affirming anything about Jesus' status. He is reporting a social reality that puzzled Roman administrators, a movement whose members treated Christ with a level of devotion that approached divinity. Pliny's interest is administrative and legal, but in passing, he gives us a snapshot of how Jesus was being regarded by adherents some decades after his death. A sharper, more historical note comes from Publius, or Gaius Cornelius Tacitus, born in 56 CE, one of Rome's most respected historians. Writing in his Annals about the Great Fire of Rome, he reports that Emperor Nero, facing suspicion that he had ordered the fire, shifted blame onto a detested group in the city, the Christians. Tacitus is critical of both Nero and the Christians, so the passage is not a friendly gloss. He then adds a concise historical datum. The founder of the movement had been executed during the reign of the Emperor Tiberius by the governor Pontius Pilate. Crucially, Tacitus's timeline and offices line up with independent data. Tiberius ruled from 14 to 37, and Pilate served as prefect of Judea from 26 to 36. He also observes that the movement, originating in Judea, had already spread to Rome by Nero's day. In a few sentences, Tacitus gives us a non-Christian, unfriendly corroboration of the basic frame: a man at the origin of the movement, executed under a known governor within a known imperial reign, followed by a rapid diffusion of his followers. Gaius Suetonius Tranquillus, another Roman writer at the turn of the 1st to the 2nd century, adds a different angle. In his The Lives of the 12 Caesars, while covering Nero, Suetonius, despite being a strong critic of the emperor, actually praises Nero's persecution of Christians. It's a small, passing reference, but it confirms that the group was visible enough in Rome to be targeted and discussed by elite authors, and it records a Roman reaction: distaste for the movement's practices coupled with approval of punitive measures. Again, these notices don't try to prove Christian claims. They simply attest that a movement centered on Christ existed, was controversial, and had spread from Judea to the heart of the empire within a generation. A different kind of testimony comes from explicit critics. The philosopher Celsus, born around the middle of the 2nd century and a vigorous opponent of Christianity, launched a polemical attack on the faith. He accused Jesus of mastering sorcery in Egypt and alleged that he was the illegitimate son of a Roman soldier in an extramarital liaison with Mary. None of this is friendly material. It's designed to discredit. But the underlying assumption is telling. Celsus does not doubt that Jesus existed. His strategy is to explain Jesus' deeds as magic and his origins as scandalous, not to deny that there was such a person at all. Rabbinic texts from late antiquity, while varied and often terse, likewise mention Jesus in hostile terms. In some of these references, he's depicted as a sorcerer who was executed, sometimes phrased as being hanged, which in ancient idiom could overlap with crucifixion, and whose body was hidden by his followers, who then declared that he had risen. These are not neutral reports. They are counter-narratives aimed at undermining Christian claims. Yet they are part of the same pattern. People who opposed the Christian message still took for granted that there had been a man at its center. Then there is the Jewish historian Flavius Josephus. He mentions Jesus in 2 places. The first concerns the fate of James. He recounts that James, the brother of Christ, was brought to trial, accused of transgressing the law, and condemned to be stoned. The second Josephus reference is more controversial. It offers a brief thumbnail of Jesus' life and observes that the movement continued after his death. Most scholars agree that later Christian copyists likely altered this passage to make it more favorable to Jesus, turning a neutral or mildly descriptive notice into something that sounded more like praise. Importantly, the mainstream view holds that they did not invent an entirely new text out of nothing. Rather, they embroidered an existing mention. In line with the point you specified, many consider that because the phrasing tracked with a style similar to that found in Hegesippus, Christian redactors probably made alterations to a citation that already existed instead of composing a fresh insertion. However one parses the exact wording, the core takeaway is the same. Josephus, a non-Christian Jewish historian writing near the end of the 1st century, treated Jesus and his brother James as real figures within Judea's recent past. Set side by side, these non-Christian sources are remarkably consistent for a provincial Jewish teacher of humble origin. These testimonies come from different genres: letters, histories, polemics, legal concerns, and different communities: Roman officials, Jewish historians, pagan philosophers. They are not coordinated. That they align on the basics is exactly the kind of convergence historians look for. Even authors determined to undermine Christianity, Celsus, rabbinic writers, attack by offering alternative explanations for Jesus' deeds and origins rather than by denying that he existed. No single piece of this record is decisive. But historical judgments rarely rest on single pieces. They rest on cumulative probabilities. It is perfectly reasonable to conclude that there was a man named Jesus who lived in Judea in the time of Pontius Pilate, gathered disciples, and was executed. That conclusion does not prove the miraculous. It does not settle matters of faith, but it does set the stage for why the movement that bears his name could erupt from a small corner of the Roman Empire and alter the course of world history. Whether one stands inside a church, outside of it, or nowhere near either, the story remains part of our shared past, and the evidence, sparse and imperfect as ancient evidence always is, points to a real person at its beginning.